Now, at their most basic level, a labor union is an organization of workers whose primary objectives are to improve the pecuniary or monetary and non-pecuniary conditions of employment among their members. Right? So unions exist to basically benefit their members. Okay. Unions can be classified as into two different types. Right. So there's two types of unions. Right. The first one would be an industrial union. Okay. An industrial union represents most or all of the workers in an industry or firm, regardless of their occupation. Okay? So, an industrial union, for example, would be like the United Auto Workers, because they're not representing only the assembly line workers, but they're representing everyone that works for an automotive company. Right? So, the UAW and the Teamsters also. Right? These would be industrial unions because they represent workers in an industry regardless of occupation. Right? So the janitor at Ford Motor Company might be included in the UAW, right? But I am not, right? Okay, so I'm not in the automotive industry at all, so I won't be included in the UAW. Okay. The other type is what we call a craft union. Okay, a craft union represents workers within a single occupation. Okay, so classic example would be the teachers union, right? Which represents, you guessed it, teachers. Okay, and so the craft unions represent sort of a specific occupation. Okay. Now, unions will bargain with employers over various aspects of their employment contract, right? Including pay and employee benefits, right? It also includes conditions of work, policies regarding hiring, overtime, job assignment and promotion and layoff, and the means by which grievances between workers and management are resolved. Okay, and so further, this bargaining can take place at sort of different levels too. So we can think of sort of a spectrum, right? On the one hand, right, we can have highly centralized bargaining. Okay, here, right, the bargaining, right, there basically would be a representative or representatives of entire industries, right, sitting at the bargaining table to decide on contracts that will bind multiple employers, right? So the UAW might bargain with Ford, GM, Chrysler, Toyota, Honda, and all the other automotive companies at the same time, right? So that would be a highly centralized bargaining unit, okay? On the other end, right, we can have sort of a decentralized bargaining process, right? And at the decentralized end of the spectrum, bargaining takes place between the union and individual firms, right? And in the middle, so somewhere between these two, right? This is, all firms simultaneously and this would be one firm at a time, right? And somewhere in between these two, right, is sort of like the percentage. So if you, let's say there's 100 different firms in the industry, and if all 100 firms sat down with the same representative at the same time, they'd be over here. If each firm bargained individually, they'd be over here. And if it was 50-50, you know, if each representative met with 50 different firms at the same time, it'd be somewhere near the middle, okay? And so we can think about the UAW, right? So I probably misspoke. The UAW would probably not be all the way over here, but they'd be pretty close. They'd certainly be close to the far left side of the spectrum here, right? And you know the Ferris Faculty Alliance, which is the union that governs or governed. I'm not actually sure how much power they have right now. They're the union that sort of represents Ferris faculty, right? Well, they'd be all the way over here, right? Because they only represent Ferris faculty. They don't represent Michigan or Michigan State or Grand Valley or Central, right? They only represent us, right? And so we'd be over here, okay? Now, as collective units, unions also represent a political force in democratic countries. And so often, unions will use this to their advantage and use the political process to secure benefits they could not easily win through collective bargaining. Some countries even have a labor union political party, right? Like Great Britain, their Labor Party. Okay? In others, the unions merely act as a lobbyist for various bills and policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Right? The key insight here is that there are often two ways for a union to get what it wants. So let's put that up here. There are two ways for a union to get what it wants. One is through collective bargaining. With employers. Right? And the other is through the political process. Okay? Like all people in all other settings, they're going to choose the one of these two that seems, made a mess, right? They're going to choose the one of these two that is sort of easiest to accomplish their goals, right? And so depending on what it is that they want, one process, right, either collective bargaining or using the political process, right, will be used over the other one. Now on page 3 of the notes, I reproduced sort of a table showing the union members as a percentage of the workers and a percentage of workers covered by some sort of a collective bargaining agreement between 1990 and 2010. Okay? And what you can see from there is that while union membership has declined over those 20 years, it's interesting that the percentage of workers that are actually covered by a collective bargaining agreement has remained largely the same over time, right? So even though fewer people are members of a union, the number of people whose contracts are decided by a union is still roughly the same, okay? And there are reasons for that, and we're going to sort of discuss some of them today, all right? But let's go over sort of the legal structure of unions in the U.S., right? Now, a lot of people have very strong opinions about whether unions are a good thing for society or a net drain on society. And the majority consensus over history seems to fall primarily on this latter, that unions seem to be a drain on society. And this is reflected by looking at the history of judicial cases against unions. So, for example, throughout the 20th century, employers were often able to claim that unions acted like monopolies in the labor market and were therefore illegal under antitrust legislation, right? In fact, these employers were often able to obtain court orders and injunctions prohibiting union activity and aiding them in stopping union organization drives. And so given this, it's unsurprising that in 1930, only 7% of the workforce was actually unionized. Let's look at a few other pieces of legislation that changed to pave the way for increasing labor penetration in the labor markets. Okay, so the first one we'll look at is the National Labor Relations Act. Which was passed in 1935. And so what this did is it required employers to bargain with unions that represented the majority of their employees and made it illegal for employers to interfere with their employees' right to organize collectively. So the NLRA is essentially the document that says that unions are legal, right? It's illegal to ban the unionization of workers, right? If your workers want to unionize, you have no right to stop them. You do, however, which is the thorn that lots of people forget about, you do have the right to basically fire them, right? Or to tell them that if they do unionize, you will fire them. So those are two different things, right? While workers have the right to unionize, and you can't have a contract or anything that says you cannot unionize. You can say, if you unionize, I will fire you, right? That doesn't violate the NLRA, okay? And so what this act also did is it established the National Labor Relations Board, right, which was given the power to both conduct certification elections to see which unions, if any, employees wanted to represent them, and two, to investigate claims that employers were either violating election rules or refusing to bargain with elected unions, right? And so so what this says, which is sort of an interesting thing, is that workers have the right to unionize, okay? And the National Labor Relations Board is allowed to basically conduct elections to see if employees want to be represented by a union. And then they also have the right to investigate claims that employers are either violating the election rules or refusing to bargain with elected unions. And so basically, employers are not allowed to physically bar employees from unionizing. They're allowed to kick non-employees off of the work site. Okay, so a union representative that does not work for the company may not be allowed to come onto the premises, but the workers are allowed to talk about unionization. They're allowed to do all kinds of things. Okay, but the employers have the right to basically say, that's fine, you can talk about it, but if you do, you're fired, right? That doesn't violate the NLRA or the NLRB, okay? But let's think of an example. So let's say that Ferris wants to start, let's say that I want to start a new union, right? I want to start a brand new union on Ferris's campus, and I'm going to get all the econ professors in on it, right? We're going to unionize and try to secure better benefits for all 6 of us, right? Ferris has no right to prevent us from talking about that, okay? And let's say that I tell everyone, hey, why don't we go meet at Panera Bread across the street and we'll go talk about unionizing, right? Ferris is not allowed to lock me in my office and prevent me from going to that meeting, right? They have no right to do any of that, okay? What Ferris can say is that, Dr. Hebert, if you establish a new union at Ferris, that's fine, you're allowed to do that, but we can and will fire you, right? So they are allowed to do that, okay, under the NLRA, okay? The second piece of legislation, which I just realized I made this inconsistent. The second piece is the Taft-Hartley TaftHartley Act, which was passed in 1947. Okay. And so after World War II, people once again began to resent unions, feeling that they had become too powerful with the passage of the NLRA. Now, this act restricted some aspects of union activity and permitted workers to vote in elections that would actually decertify a union from representing them in collective bargaining. Right? It also allowed states to pass so-called right-to-work laws, right, which prohibit membership in a union as a requirement for employment. Okay, so if a company, if the workers at a company were to unionize under the NLRA, right, one of the things they would often do is require membership in their union as a condition for employment. So you cannot work there unless you join the union. Okay, the Taft-Hartley Act gave states the right to basically declare that illegal. Okay? Now, it's important to recognize that laws of this sort don't prohibit unionization. Okay? So, right-to-work laws do not say that unionization is illegal. They only prohibit requiring people to join a union as a condition of employment. Okay? So, for example, Michigan recently voted to become a right-to-work state, right? And this means that the Ferris faculty, which were previously required to join the FFA, the Ferris Faculty Alliance, right, which is a union that represents, Ferris faculty, right? Previously or prior to that, anyone who came to work at Ferris was also required to join the union, right? Today, we're not, right? The FFA, or the Ferris Faculty Alliance, still exists on campus today, and it still represents well over 90% of the faculty here. But now, new hires have the ability to decide if they want to join the FFA or not while they work here. So the Taft-Hartley Act basically allows states to become right to work states, right? It makes it illegal, which would, if they became a right to work state, right? This would make it illegal to require union membership as a condition for employment, right? It does not make unions illegal. Okay, so I want to emphasize that the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 did not make unions illegal. Okay? Now, there were a couple other acts that I want to go through real quick. The third one is the Landrum-Griffin Act. Which was passed in 1959. And what this law did was curb sort of the corruption of union leaders, which had become a serious problem over the period of like 1939 to 1959, with many union bosses acting in their own narrow self-interest and taking advantage of their positions. Okay, and so what they were doing, what the union bosses were doing in this era, was basically taking advantage of the fact that they were the union boss, right? They were basically skimming money off the top. They were being highly corrupt. Imagine the most corrupt CEO that you can imagine, right? And now imagine that the president of the labor union or the head of the labor union was behaving in exactly the same way, okay? And so just like we regulate and say, corporate CEOs are not allowed to be jerks, right? And skim money off the top of their company. We also said with the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959 that union bosses are not allowed to do that either. And so what this act requires is complete disclosure of union activities and finances to union members, with the goal being to increase transparency and also require regularly scheduled elections and accountability of union leadership. Okay? So this act was literally just one that said, hey, you know what? The union boss might be taking advantage of his position. We want to make sure. Right? So just increase the transparency of what the union boss was doing. Okay? And then the last one that I want to go over, there's lots of other laws, but the last one I want to go over is Executive Order number 10988, which was passed in 1962. Okay. Now, prior to this, government workers and all workers in the public sector were prohibited from unionizing. Okay. President Kennedy changed this by signing this executive order. Now, it's important to note that the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 supersedes this order by prohibiting public workers from going on strikes. Okay. However, so this executive order basically says government workers have the right to unionize too. Okay. Now, then it was augmented by the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978 to basically say the government cannot go on strike. Okay, so the government workers have the right to unionize, but they are not allowed to go on strike. And the basic thinking behind the Civil Service Reform Act was not to try to rob government unions of their power, right? It was to basically protect the American people, right? And it says that the government workers are not allowed to go on strike because what they are doing is of vital national security, right? So imagine if like the military went on strike, or if the Coast Guard went on strike, or if like Congress and all the congressional workers went on strike, right? Some people might say that that'd be a great thing because then government wouldn't be able to do anything, right? Those would be like the libertarians, right? But everyone else would kind of say like, okay, look, that's bad. We need government to be working. We need government to be doing things in order to safeguard society. And so we're going to make it illegal for government employees to go on strike, okay? And so all this is doing is to prevent, basically the government from stopping, right? That's what it is. But the interesting thing is that this didn't stop air traffic controllers, who are federal or government employees, right? It didn't stop air traffic controllers from going on strike a few years ago. And so it's not clear that this one's as binding as people like to pretend, okay? Now, what is it that unions really want? Right? So what do unions actually want? Well, generally speaking, they just want more, right? At least this is what Sam Gompers, the founder of the American Federation of Labor, answered with when someone asked him that exact question, right? Now, obviously, saying that unions want more is a gross oversimplification of what unions want, but at the same time, it's not exactly inaccurate, right? Hardly anyone would disagree with the observation that unions want to advance the overall welfare of their members, in one way or another, right? And if they didn't want to do that, nobody would bother joining a union to begin with, right? So if you don't believe me on that one, think of the opposite case. Would anyone voluntarily join an organization that promised to, for a fee, right, leave them alone or actually make them worse off, right? Of course not. And so the only reason why union members would pay a fee to someone is because they expect to get something out of it in return. Now, some objectives of unions are merely procedural, right? In that unions seek to give employees sort of a voice in the way employers manage the workplace, especially when it comes to various HR issues such as job assignment, the composition of employee benefit packages, and the establishment of joint labor management safety committees and work teams. These objectives are not always costly to employers. In fact, they can be quite beneficial as it makes it easier for management and labor to discuss, the various aspects of the working environment and improve communication so that better decisions can ultimately be made. Other procedural objectives, however, put limits on managerial prerogatives, right, that are often seen as costly. Some of these may even have unintended consequences that may end up harming employees, right? And so we'll come back to that part later on in the notes. In general, though, wanting more typically refers to compensation of union members. The most visible element of this is the wage rate, but unions bargain over all sorts of things from pensions to health insurance and vacation days. The attempts to secure more for their members, however, take place within the context of constraints. For example, or in effect, union members often cannot have everything despite their wishes. And so what the next section we're going to do is think more about the constraints, what constrains the demands of unions.